Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
Hi. So far we haven't explicitly mentioned one of FM Alexander's most important concepts or ideas, which is the primary control. So can you explain what your understanding of the primary control is? How is this different from how it's commonly understood in the Alexander technique world at the moment? And how does this tie in with what we've already been talking about with in reference to experience and practice and judgment?
Yes, it's a question that has come up. Recently, you asked for the listeners to put questions to us, and so this is one question that has come up. And in fact, I find that this question is very useful to expand on the subject we were discussing. So the subject we've been discussing has been yes, experience, experiments, and judgment. So this time we're going to expand on this theme, but we are going to introduce our vision, or my vision, if you want, of this term that is called the primary control. So the first thing is to bring back the last episode. And in the last episode, Alexander was practicing. So when he's practicing, I wanted to demonstrate that he's experimenting, that he's not experiencing something, he's not feeling something, he's got a plan, and he wants to see whether he can use verbal instructions in order to generate new movements that will coordinate together to, in fact, produce a new use. And so he's experimenting and he's forming his judgment in this way. And so it's very interesting to read his writings to see what sort of judgment he's making out of the experiments he's conducting. So there was this experiment where he discovered that when he was reciting, projecting his voice to the camera, he was making movements that he could see. While these movements were really very difficult to see when he was just speaking normally. And so the first thing he noticed was the certain movement with the neck and with the head. So he thought that the neck and head was central because, in fact, the voice box, he was suffering from an inflammation of the voice box. So as the voice box is mostly in the neck, he thought that the neck and head relationship was central to his voice problems. And then makes a new experiment, and this experiment gives a new evidence. So in the new evidence, he discovers that he's been pulling back with the head and the neck, and that this pulling back of the head and neck was always associated with a lifting of the chest and a shortening of the what he called the stature. He does not define exactly what he means by stature, but we can imagine that if you are to measure the stature, either you measure from the floor to the head, or sometimes we measure from the floor to the top of the torso to see how the person is using the different parts, you will see, of the mechanism of the torso. So this is what Alexander is saying. It's page 8 of the Use of the Self. It's the book that, in fact, retrace the experiments that Alexander made and how, with these guided experiments, he, in fact, formed a judgment. So this new piece of evidence suggested that the function or the functioning of the organs of speech was influenced by my manner of using the whole torso, and that the pulling of the head back and down was not, as I had presumed, merely a misuse of the specific parts concerned, but one that was inseparably bound up with a misuse of other mechanisms which involved the act of shortening the stature. So this is what Alexander is saying. He's saying that the pulling of the head and back was not merely a specific misuse of the part, but it was a misuse that was inseparably bound up with a misuse of other mechanisms. So in this demonstration, Alexander is not placing the neck and head as the cause of the other misuses. It's one of them. It's one of the symptoms of faulty use of the whole self, of the whole anatomical structure. So this suddenly strikes a chord because I've been trained as a modern Alexander teacher, and in the modern Alexander technique, very often the concept of primary control is a certain use of the head and neck will in fact lead to a certain use of all the other mechanisms. Here, Alexander is putting a completely different judgment. He's saying that it's just one of the different symptoms that create the wrong use of the self as a whole. And he adds, if this were so, it would clearly be useless to expect such improvement as I needed from merely preventing the wrong use of the head and neck. I realized that I must also prevent those other associated wrong uses which brought about the shortening of the stature. So suddenly Alexander is saying that the head and neck is not the primary control of the use, for example, of the mechanism of the torso. We will see that his judgment goes further, and he says that the head and neck is not the cause of the wrong use of the feet, for example. So this is just to say that reading this passage, I started to disagree or refute the concept of primary control as transmitted by the modern Alexander technique. That's the start of many investigations, because I wanted to see whether Alexander, of course, was right, whether maybe had changed his mind later, because this is 1932, and maybe he changed his mind later. Maybe if you read the book in 1942, maybe you will see something different. Maybe if you watch the film that he is made of his lesson, of course, 20 years later, you will see a difference. Well, I made these investigations. I saw no difference, none whatsoever. And this goes back because I made also the check because I wanted to see if before there was other ideas with that which connect with this thing that the functioning of the organs of speech, where he had a problem, was influenced by his manner of using the whole torso. That's something that sounded familiar to me, and obviously it was very familiar because if you go back to the previous book, which is the first book, for example, Man's Supreme Inheritance. In Man's Supreme Inheritance, their sentences are clearly against the idea of the modern Alexander technique concept of primary control. For example, just to make the point, here is one. This is page 141. And here again, you will see we have a clear indication that Alexander doesn't believe that the neck should be guided in order to solve the problem of use of the mechanism of the torso, but on the opposite, it's the correct use of the different movements of the parts of the torso, which will bring the solution we are after. So here is what Alexander is saying, and this, of course, is in 1910. So it's the first book, the start of his work. He says, the specific control of the finger, of the neck, or of the legs should primarily be the result of the conscious guidance and control of the mechanism of the torso, particularly of the antagonistic muscular actions which bring about those correct and greater coordination intended to control the movement of the limb, neck, respiratory mechanism, and the general activity of the internal organs. So, of course, I was attracted to this part because he's talking of the specific control of the neck. And one of the orders or instruction that we experiment with, or that I experimented with when I was learning the modern Alexander technique or teaching the modern Alexander technique was, of course, let the neck be free. It sounds as if we are asked to, in fact, perform a mental act, a conscious act with the neck. When somebody says, let the neck be free, you think that you should feel or do something with the neck part. Well, here, it's absolutely obvious that Alexander is saying that the state of the neck and the states of the movements of the neck depends on some conscious guidance and control of the mechanism of the torso. The mechanism is made of articulated parts, and the movements of these parts are going to affect, in fact, the relationship between the parts. So on the picture I showed you, there are two different torso presented. One torso is, of course, arched so that there is a lengthening of the front. And obviously, you will see there is a shortening at the back. And this is, according to Alexander, the incorrect geometrical relationship between the different parts. You will see he mentioned the protruding abdomen, the shoulder blade that are pushed back, the upper torso that is lifted and thrown back, the middle back that is thrown forward. For him, this is an incorrect use of the mechanism of the torso, and for him, that incorrect use of the mechanism of the torso is causing invariably a shortening of the neck, a wrong use of the movements of the different parts of the neck and head. So when you want to define primary control, if you ask me, do we have a definition for the primary control? Yes, it's here. It's these relationships, these geometrical relationship between the different parts of the torso that you can assume through a series of coordinated movement that bring about those correct and greater coordination. When you say greater coordination, you're talking about a use of the self as a whole. If you want to improve the mechanism of the neck, you have to improve the mechanism of the torso first. If you want to improve the movement of the feet or knees or hips, you have to improve the mechanism of the torso first. When we say it's primary, we just think that all the muscles are in fact attached, start from the mechanism of the torso. So the organization of the movement of the mechanism of the torso will bring antagonistic actions. Well, of course, because the movement of the torso are going to be opposed from one another. This will stretch the elastic fabric of the anatomical structure that we call the connective tissues or the fascia, if you want. And when the fascia are stretched, well, they just react as a biomechanical spring, which means that they stiffen. But it's an elastic stiffness, which will maintain the joint in the position in which their function should be met. And so they will maintain the structure in what we call a position of mechanical advantage. So yes, the primary control is for me exactly that. It's the organization of the movements of the different parts of the torso, which means that you can have a correct guidance of the mechanism of the torso as well as an incorrect one. And most of the time in our experiment, we use simple orders of movements. We ask the person to perform some movements, and we just check on video to see what is happening when the movement is performed to the different parts of the mechanism of the torso. What are the messages the person, well, you would not use messages nowadays. Alexander does that, but it's better to see the orders, the command for these movements that the person is sending. The person is not aware that she's sending orders to the middle torso or orders to the upper torso. She's not. The person is just performing the movement as she can. Yes, but when you look at the movement from the outside, especially on a video recording, you will see that these movements occur. And you will see that these movements are pretty repetitive. It's like Alexander used the term idiosyncrasy. Idiosyncrasy means that it's repeated like automatically without any reasoning entering into the picture. The person just performed that. And if these movements are incorrect, we talk about an incorrect use of the mechanism of the torso or an incorrect use of the primary control. So that is how we consider the primary control in the initial Alexander technique. So Alexander, when he talks about his experiments, he says that he saw in his activity, which is a very special one, declaiming, reciting very loudly in front of a mirror to impersonate someone else than you. He was doing that in front of a mirror, and it's because he was observing himself in the mirror that he started to, in fact, make reasoned judgments. He was not perceiving as feeling what he was doing. He was observing. When you're observing, especially a video, because with a mirror, it's still difficult because when you are performing in front of a mirror, the direct stimulus that you get from the mirror is very strong. It's very difficult not to interfere and not to try to refine the way you're projecting yourself. For example, when I speak to you, I make sure that I'm not looking at myself in my second monitor. I do look at another monitor, but I'm not here. I am on the side. I do not want to observe how I'm sitting, how I'm presenting myself to the camera. This is much more interesting to, well, use a camera to record oneself and then watch oneself later. When you watch yourself later, you will see what sort of movements you are doing when you don't see yourself, when you don't observe exactly how you are performing. Yes. So I think Alexander found a way to get around that problem of interference, of self guided interference, as if I'm looking at how I am sitting and I'm just trying and make some adjustment looking at myself. Alexander was using sets of mirrors where he could, for example, have a view of his back or a view of his side when he was performing. And suddenly, when you have a view of the side, for example, with mirrors, there is the problem of reflection is that the movement are the wrong way. The one way round, and so when you think you should go forward, in fact, it's back on the mirror, and this requires of you a reasoning process. You must remember, yes, if I want the middle torso to go back, I must perform a movement as if I wanted to go forward regarding what I see. So as you cannot carry a video recorder all the time or a mirror all the time, especially not a set of mirrors, it's much better to work without any direct, immediate feedback. So yeah, there is no problem anymore. So Alexander was watching himself, and he's also presenting himself. When he's talking about his way, this is what he's saying. So we are back to the use of the self. And Alexander continues on this problem that he found, that his vocal organs, in fact, were not only adjusted to the head and neck position, but of course, the voice box and the lungs are attached to the torso. So he found that the torso was involved. But more than that, he went on to say that when he's talking about the associated wrong uses, the head and neck movement are associated with other uses of the mechanism of the torso, but not only. That's what he says. Observation in the mirror showed me that when I was standing to recite, I was using these other parts in certain wrong ways, which synchronize with my wrong way of using my head and neck. Larynx, vocal, breathing organs, and which involved a condition of undue muscle tension throughout my organism. I pause a second because this condition of undue muscle tension throughout the organism has created havoc in the mind of his followers. They have in fact, reasoned this in a completely different way that I did. They said that when you have a wrong way of using the head and neck, you have an undue muscle tension. If you stop using the head and neck wrongly, a new use of the primary control for the modern Alexander technique, the undue muscle tension will disappear. I see this completely differently. And it's very important when we talk about the primary control to be very clear about this. So if there is a wrong way of using the head and neck, this wrong way of using the head and neck is always associated for us with the wrong way of using the different other mechanisms, the mechanism of the arms, mechanism of the torso, mechanism of the legs and feet. Yes, and when you say that this involved the condition of undue muscle tension, you're not saying at all that the condition of undue muscle tension is creating these problems. You say that there is a set of mental objects that you've seen, that you've experimented with, that you have a judgment about, and this set is associated with a set of undue muscle tension. Nothing says either that when Alexander is using the term undue, he means excessive only. There are different passages where we see that he can use undue with both ideas that are opposite, which is excessive muscle tension or inefficient muscle tension, ineffective muscle tension, insufficient muscle tension. This is also undue muscle tension. So the question of the cause and consequence is fundamental when you think about the primary control. We say that the primary control is the use of the movements of the different parts of the torso to create, well, antagonistic action. And these antagonistic actions are, in fact, responsible for creating antagonistic pools. Antagonistic pools are tensions. Antagonistic pools are not release. You have to be very clear. The term pool means that you're stretching some elastic fabric. If you stretch some elastic fabric, you're not getting release. You're getting new pools. Alexander is not, in fact, proposing a technique for stressed people that want release. No, he's proposing a technique that has been reasoned out of experiments and judgments that are not proposing to, in fact, a release. He says collapse. No, these are to improve the way we use the different parts in order to, in fact, well, create a strong physical self, not a released physical strength. So Alexander continues and say, I observed that this condition of undue muscle tension affected particularly the use of my legs, feet, and toes. My toes being contracted and bent downward in such a way that my feet were unduly arched, my weight thrown more on the outside of my feet as it should have been, and my balance interfered with. So the neck and head reaction is not separable from the use of the feet. Of course, the whole lower torso, when you want to use the mechanism of the torso, the whole lower torso is supported by the feet. If you imagine a problem of equilibrium, if you set, for example, if you have a habit of using the feet that creates movement that tends to unduly arch the feet so that the weight is thrown on the outside, where we know that there is very little bony support. Someday I will make a recording just on that. You will have to realize that as the legs have the same length, it will be impossible to maintain the pelvis horizontal, which means that the spine is going to be curved on one side to compensate. You can, well, order the neck to be free all your life, order the head to go forward and up all your life. It will not change a thing. And I started to become convinced that Alexander was on the right track, because I've noticed that many elderly teachers of the Alexander technique that have practiced quite a long time still had scoliosis that were visible, still had a very what I call deformed feet. You know, feet that are either collapsed on one side or the other. I remember that teacher that was asking a lesson from me very forcefully during a conference, and she said, you need to give me some lesson. I was told that you can do something for me. I said, I'm not I'm certain that the person was equivocated, because I cannot do anything for you. I can just give you a lesson. And she said, cut the crap, which is interesting. And the idea is that if you do not solve the movements of the different parts of the toe, foot, and ankle leg mechanism, well, there is no way that directing the modern Alexander primary control and neck and back is ever going to change anything on the way you use your feet. And if you don't change the way you use your feet, the deformation is going to stay, the knees are going to be set askew, you're going to suffer, and you're going to continue increase your scoliosis. I remember a teacher saying, well, I have a scoliosis, the Alexander technique can do nothing about this because this is a disease. Well, scoliosis is a functional problem. It's not a disease. There is no bone destruction. It's just that you're shortening on one side more than the other. So in this, Alexander is very clear. For example, when he says the use of the feet, look at the picture I was showing. When you look at the picture I was showing, Alexander is saying that, well, it's a picture from the same book. No, it's a picture from Man Supreme Inheritance. It's the picture that goes with the chapter where he says that the primary principle in attaining the correct standing position is the placing of the feet. And then he starts to describe the placing of the feet. I have totally ignored his description, because he's describing a 45-degree angle or one foot in front of the other. You never know which one is the right. But if you look at the picture that he's proposing, it's a picture that is on the lower part of that image. If you look at that picture, suddenly the placing of the feet as something you can reason with. You can clearly see there is an incorrect picture. Is picture B, the one on the right, is incorrect. That's how Alexander is saying it's incorrect. We know it's Alexander performing for the camera. So we saw very clearly that in this picture, the hips are set very far forward of the feet. We wouldn't say that the feet have been placed backward relatively to the middle torso, because we don't see the mechanism of the torso as central most of the time. But in the initial Alexander technique, when you start to think that the mechanism of the torso is the center of the primary control, you could say something that the feet have been misplaced. The feet should not be placed much further back than the lower part of the torso. Because if you set the feet much further back, you will find that the whole body tends to fall forward in space. And so there is an equilibrium problem to be solved. Of course, the equilibrium problem on the right picture is solved. It's solved by having the upper torso pull very far backward in order to have as much weight forward and backward relative to the line of the front of the instep. So that person is shortening the back because she has a habit of performing some movements which bring the lower part of the torso very much forward of the upper part of the torso. While in the correct image, we start to see, well, different movements in action. We see that instead of projecting the hips very far forward, well, apparently the person has inhibited that movement. The person has refused to set the hips very far forward of the front of the ankle on the correct position. We see that the middle torso has gone exactly in the same direction, which is backward relatively to the front of the ankle, but also, well, you can't see it here, but when the person is reacting to the way of placing the feet, we see that the sternum bone is inclined backward as a result of projecting the upper torso backward. So the antagonistic movements, because they are antagonistic movements, we see that the middle torso and the front of the torso are going forward while the upper torso is going back in space. The person is already using the antagonistic action. The person is already using the mechanism of the torso. We object to that use. We say this is the wrong use. It's a use that will bring the shortening of the back, which would bring the pouter pigeon chest with the sternum bone inclined backward at the top, with the protruding abdomen. Everything is set in there. This cannot be separated from the way the person is using the mechanism of the toe, foot, ankle, and leg mechanism. It's part of it. If you don't solve the way the person is arching the feet and placing the weight on the outside of the feet, there is no way that the mechanism of the torso movement will be improved. The way the legs are used is going to resist the new use of the mechanism of the torso. So this is a completely different way to understand what we call the primary control. Yes, it's a primary control in the sense that we want to obtain new geometrical relationship between the different parts of the torso. So when you look at the person from the side, that is the sagittal view, well, you want all the frontal parts of the torso to be aligned to the front of the ankle. The mechanism of the torso cannot be separated from the feet, especially in standing, for example. Yes, as standing is an habitual activity, standing has to be solved, as well as another activity that is eminently problematic is walking, because you can teach people to sit and stand so that they are effectively using the mechanism of the torso so that the feet are supporting the legs and torso to be aided and influenced by gravity. But also, as soon as a person starts to walk, you will tend to look at what the person is doing with the mechanism of the torso in walking. Okay, it's very simple. You can test. You can give the person a simple stimulus to walk. Say, well, for a moment, could you have a rest and have a walk in the room while we are going to continue the lesson later, but for the moment, have a walk. The person has just readjusted the mechanism of the torso relatively to the knees, to the ankle, and to the feet mechanism. And you want to see what's going to happen. What you will see is that as soon as the person who knows now how to organize the movements of the different parts of the torso in standing, as soon as she starts walking, everything disappears. She returns to the old use. She returns to the old misuse of the mechanism of the torso, and as a result, the neck and head are projected, and as a result of this wrong movement, the tension in the mechanisms is totally undue, meaning that in some parts there is absolutely inefficient tension, release and collapse, and other parts are effectively very shortened and very fixed. But you cannot have a very fixed joint without, on the other side, somewhere else in the whole mechanism, something that is absolutely unduly laxed. If you try to solve the problem of coordination by targeting the stiff joint, you're just going to make the problem worse, because solving the problem of stiff joint is never going to increase the activity in the part that is unduly released. So that is the way we use the term primary control. So this idea that the neck and head relationship is not central is further explained. So, for example, I'm taking now a passage from the Universal Constant in Living, that 1946. Well, it's a 1946 edition. It was written in 1942. And so Alexander is talking about a reaction. A person is reacting to the idea of standing. Yes, and so we are going to see, again, when the person is reacting to the idea of standing, that the feet are involved, of course, and Alexander is listing everything that we can, all the symptoms that are associated with the person reaction. So this is the idea. And so Alexander is saying, of course, there is a deformity of the neck. The person has a tendency to hold the neck in one direction and the head is pulled on one side. He says the fixation of the cervical spine and head. Well, yes, that means that the head and spines are more to one side than to the other. He's talking about the round humped back, the uneven position of the shoulders, the undue lordosis, and the slight lumbar curve of the spine, the extreme anterior position of the pelvis in standing, the unduly protruded abdomen, the contracted chest, and the undue tension of the arms and legs, even when he was in a sitting position. His habitual tendency of slumping when seated. All these were evidence of the vicious circle involving reflex spasm in overaction of muscle groups, which Dr. Caldwell wrote was further menacing the deformity and increasing the pain. To put it simply, a person manifesting these conditions is being gradually pulled down and bent forward, the forward being chiefly from the pelvis, in much the same way as if his feet were fastened to the floor and he were being day by day more and more pulled forward and down by means of a rope fixed around the neck. It's a very interesting, Alexander gives many details. So my advice to my own pupil is that when you see a description like this, it's quite interesting to, in fact, represent what Alexander is saying, because very often I've seen people try and just read the book, and when I ask them the question about what was the shape Alexander was exactly describing, they were not describing at all what Alexander, in fact, presents. So here I have tried my own representation of this page, of this, quote, excerpt from the book. And so we have a person that is pulled down and bent forward. So the forward is chiefly from the pelvis. Yes. And so we see that the upper part of the torso is further back than the middle and lower part of the torso. The person, as being pulled forward by the placing of the feet, yes, must arch back. If the person does not arch back, the person is falling. This is an equilibrium. solution. This is a postural problem that we see. The person is certainly solving a postural problem. More and more, of course, the muscles of the back are never lengthened. The fascia at the back, the springs that could, in fact, maintain the connection between the upper torso and the leg, these are absolutely unused. So that's the problem with biomechanical springs, is that if you don't stretch them, if you don't apply work on them, because they are not working when they are short, well, they waste. And so that person will not benefit from the same elastic reaction of the back structure as a person that every day sits with a torso that is lengthening and widening. When the primary control is used correctly, we are not talking of a vicious circle, but the exact opposite, a virtuous circle. It's a virtuous circle to lengthen the back. And so we come back to the definition of lengthening of the back that Alexander has, well, exemplified in his videos, either on the pupil he was working with. And as I said in my last video, really look at the picture, because this has nothing to do with the modern conception of lengthening the back. I totally disagree with the modern conception of lengthening the back, as I disagree with their concept of primary control. We use exactly the same sequence of words, but the meaning and the reasoning behind it is completely, completely different. The modern Alexander technique, when they want to explain what it is, what is making the Alexander technique work, they explain that is, well, I've seen a paper. It's very funny. We'll have to discuss it someday. It's the tone. It's the electrical activation of the muscles that is reorganized by the modern Alexander technique. Makes me laugh, makes me wonder if these people are really, well, really thinking these things. No, what is the modern Alexander technique? Well, it's a positioning of the body using the hands in a somatic process. What is the initial Alexander technique? Well, it's asking the person, first of all, to inhibit certain movements. We use the term inhibition, but the idea is to inhibit. We want that the person inhibit this idea of sending the front of the pelvis forward in space and sending the upper torso back in space. It's fairly easy to understand. You don't need a neurophysiology training in order to understand this. You will understand what it is you're exactly doing with the movements of the different parts, and you're going to be asked whether you can use instructions, verbal instructions, in order, well, to change. And the first change is, first of all, to refuse to do these movements. When we do an experiment, we don't know if the person is going to, the person herself doesn't know. She's never used more than one instruction at a time. So if suddenly you ask her to inhibit 3 movements, she has to use 3 instructions. Well, she will repeat the instruction one after the other. But in practice, she will have to make one intention. She'll have to memorize what are the movements she wants to inhibit and decide in herself, in her mind, in her memory, if you want, how to use her memory. It's a mental act, and say, I am going to refuse to do these 3 movements. I'm going to refuse to do the movement of the lower torso forward, the middle torso forward, the upper torso back. Is that possible? And that is done. For example, I have shown under this picture, you see two different pictures, and you may recognize the bone of the feet. And in both pictures, you will see the same configuration. The stimulus I've given to the people to the student is an order. I've said to the person, please, could you stand on your heels? At first, the person will look at me strangely, wondering what it is I mean. What I mean is get the front of the feet totally off the floor. create an equilibrium experiment? Can you keep in equilibrium when standing on the heels? And I'm going to look at what are the movements of the different parts of that mechanism of the toe, foot, ankle, and leg mechanism. I'm very interested to see how the person will go up on the heels. It's an equilibrium experiment, yes. And really, I'm not going to look at the feet. I'm going to look at the mechanism of the torso itself. I want to see whether the person can hit a bit, pulling the neck back, the middle torso forward, and the lower torso down when she responds to that stimulus. This is a reason experiment. Once the person has performed the act, I will show her a video of what she's done, because she will never believe what I'm going to tell her that she has reacted with a lot of movements. And these movements were coordinated, certainly, but they were coordinated to produce a wrong use of the mechanism of the torso, a wrong use of the primary control. I'm going to ask her whether she can, in fact, repeat the experiment, but this time with orders of definite inhibitions of certain movements, and orders, of course, of definite performance of other movements. And of course, I'm going to ask her whether she can, in fact, go up on the heels, which is a very strong postural stimulation. It's like a postural perturbation. People are not used to lift the front of the foot off the floor. And we are going to see how the person can coordinate the movement of the mechanism of the foot according to reason orders. And of course, the movement of the mechanism according to other orders that are equally, in fact, thought about, designed according to the use of the whole self. We don't work on the feet, or we don't really work on the mechanism of the torso movements. We work on the coordination of the movement of the mechanism of the foot with the mechanism of the torso. This is what I call the training of the conscious direction of the mechanism that we call the primary control of the use of the self. I am afraid I have more to say, but I need to interrupt here. And next time, I'm going to continue and start explaining how this relates with how Alexander defined the technique in his last book, in the universal constant in living.
For everyone watching the video, if you check out the notes underneath, you'll get links to Jeando's websites and where you can book a lesson. And we will see you next week. Thanks, Jeando.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.